Hello, thank you. So my name is Kate Heddleston. I'm incredibly excited to be here today. This is my very first CUSEC conference, which kind of makes sense because I am not Canadian, but several of my friends had been and they had the most wonderful things to say about the conference. And I've met a bunch of people here who have been for 4 years or 5 years or 7 years, which I find really impressive, and that says loads about a conference, so I'm very excited. I also think it's wonderful that Canadian students have a conference to go to. We don't have one in the States, or at least not one that I know about, so I'm really jealous. So a little bit about me. I'm a software engineer from San Francisco. I build mostly early stage web applications, and I really like building the parts of the application that interface with the user. I'm generally pretty programming language agnostic, but I do use a lot of Python, and I'm a big fan of the Python community, even more so than the language. If you get bored during this talk, you can find everything you never wanted to know about me at kateheddleston.com/about. You can also tweet at me, Heddle317. Here is Thumper from the movie Bambi with your social media public service announcement of the day. I really believe he was a rabbit ahead of his time. I've had a lot of titles in my career. Almost all of them have been completely made up. I was first hired as a software engineer at a small startup out of college, but at the time, titles like software rockstar or software ninja were really common, and I decided that there was a title missing from the list. So I became a software princess, and this was my screensaver. But I decided that that wasn't instilling the right amount of fear and conveying the right amount of power, so I added the word warrior into the middle of my title and changed it to Software Warrior Princess. And this became my screensaver. And my latest made-up title is Gainfully Fun-Employed Entrepreneur, which roughly translates to unemployed. And I basically sit at home on my couch all day programming with my dog Rudy. He really gets in the way. But it's awesome. It's actually really amazing. And I would have made this entire presentation photos of him, but I decided that that would be inappropriate. So basically, if you want to talk to somebody about getting a job or an internship, probably don't come talk to me. But if you want to talk to someone about making amazing life decisions, also probably don't come talk to me. However, if you want to talk to someone about making life decisions that make it really hard for your parents to tell their friends what you're doing for a job at a cocktail party, then you should definitely come talk to me. I can be really helpful in that area. So the title of my talk today is, What Does It Mean to Be a Software Engineer? But as I was writing this talk, it essentially turned into 3 things I wish I'd known when I started programming. And these aren't just things that I wish I'd known when I started programming. These are also things that I think about almost daily as a software engineer. Now, this talk is my personal biased opinion about what I think it means to be a software engineer in today's world. And I don't expect you to agree with everything that I say. But I hope that some of the things that we talk about will make you think about your role as a programmer going forward. Also, if you have any thoughts or questions during the talk, there will be some time at the end for questions, so please store those up. The question discussion part of a talk is usually my favorite part because I get tired of listening to myself about 15 minutes in. So without further ado, here are 3 things that I wish I'd known when I started programming. So code is just one person's opinion about how to solve a problem. Your ideologies are just as important as your code, and software engineering is a young field, and we still don't know what we don't know. So diving into the first topic. When I first started programming after college, this is me, just after college, I had no idea what I was doing, and I assumed that everyone else I worked with did. They were all older, although at the time I didn't realize that it wasn't by much, and they all seemed much wiser. They had all of these opinions and convictions and beliefs in what was right and what was wrong. And during our daily stand-up check-ins, people would throw out all these big words that I had never heard before, acronyms that I didn't know the meaning of, and names of technologies and frameworks that sounded like gibberish. Python is not a snake. Django is not a movie. Celery is not a food. RabbitMQ has nothing to do with animals. And fabric does not have anything to do with clothes. For the first month, I distinctly remember not understanding most of the words that people said, but I nodded and smiled and pretended that I did. For me, this feeling of being lost started during my undergraduate degree. I started programming in my second year at university, so I hadn't seen a terminal until I was 19 years old. And I went through my degree mostly in isolation. I didn't really have any friends who were programmers, so I did all of my assignments and problem sets alone. I assumed that I was a bad programmer because I had no understanding of how I fit into the larger system of programmers. I also assumed that getting an A meant you were good at something, and getting anything less than an A meant that you weren't. And spoiler alert, I did not get straight A's in college. So when I started working with people who had actual experience, I assumed that they were all much better at programming. And I naively believed them when they told me that something was right and another thing was wrong. Of course, as with every origin story, there was a pivotal moment where everything changed. I was talking to my coworkers, and we had been meeting about replacing a library in our code, removing it from our code base. The library wasn't doing what we wanted it to, and it was causing some issues and bugs. The meeting devolved into a full-on bashing session. Has anyone ever been a part of one of those? I have. One of my teammates was ripping into the code base and all of its shortcomings. And being a pretty funny, charismatic guy, this had previously made me laugh quite a lot. But this time it was different for me. For the first time, I actually knew the creator of a framework. I had met him a few months ago at a conference, and he was this really nice, kind of shy guy who liked writing software. And suddenly what we were doing, making fun of someone else's work, seemed really, really wrong. It went from laughing in general to laughing at someone. And that day I had a realization, and this realization has had a profound impact on the way that I program and the way that I interact with my fellow programmers. I realized that there is a person behind almost every line of code, and that code is just their opinion about how to solve a problem. This was a breakthrough moment for me. Not only did I decide to become a nicer person, or at least to keep my mean thoughts to myself, but it also completely changed how I approached programming. See, I know how to have an opinion. My parents and siblings will tell you that I'm very good at having strong opinions, especially about topics that don't matter at all. When you're talking about opinions, right and wrong is not usually the correct paradigm. There's better and worse, there's confusing and clear, there's well-formed and ill-formed, but I would argue that most of programming is not well-defined enough for right or wrong to really have a place. And if forming a good opinion is the key to being a better programmer, it's important to look at the key elements to forming a strong opinion. So I think there are three things that go into having a good opinion: that it's well-informed, that it's organized, and that it's clear. And I believe that this is true across platforms, whether you're writing an essay or whether you're writing code. And every single person in this room is capable of having a well-informed, organized, and clear opinion on a topic. It might take some time and effort, but it's within all of our grasp. I had spent all this time thinking that being a good programmer hinged on being smart, getting A's in school, and knowing the difference between some mythical right and wrong. Instead, being a good programmer involves being well-informed, organized, and clear. And so while mastering these things is not trivial and might actually take a lifetime, this made the idea of becoming a better programmer more manageable. I didn't need to get smarter, and the reason that I couldn't figure out right and wrong was that it wasn't relevant to what we were doing. So there are a lot of opinions out there, and I mean a lot. There's Django versus Flask versus Rails versus whatever they use in PHP. There's AngularJS versus React versus jQuery versus Backbone versus D3. You've got C versus C++ versus Java versus Python versus Ruby, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. Being a good programmer doesn't mean that you know about every single framework, language, or tool that exists. It doesn't mean that you have to care about everything out there that's being built. In fact, it's not possible, but more importantly, it's not really that useful. If you become a web developer, like me, you'll need to know some general information about web frameworks that exist and their trade-offs. Some frameworks, like Django or Rails, do everything for you. Other frameworks, like Sinatra or Flask, only do certain things for you, and then you have to use other libraries to fill in functionality that you would like to add in. So many of you might have no idea what those tools are, which is totally fine, but for me, it's very important to be able to compare and contrast these types of tools. On the other hand, I couldn't tell you much about programming languages for operating systems, network engineering, or embedded systems. I don't really know much about those libraries or what they do, but it's not relevant for me day to day, and it's okay that I don't know about them. Being good at your craft is about knowing the opinions that matter for what you do, knowing the opinions that have been important historically, and understanding what code you agree with and you disagree with. Some of the opinions out there are very well informed, they're very organized, and they're very clear. And these opinions are worth studying and emulating. So you can think of most of the major languages that are very famous are worth studying. Understanding the major milestones in the history of computing languages is important. I would highly recommend reading a little bit about the history of programming languages. Understanding the evolution from using assembly language to the first programming languages that had compilers, like Fortran and COBOL. The evolution of languages that led to C, which was an early systems programming language, C++, which was systems programming language plus object-oriented, to Java, which was object-oriented plus garbage cleanup, and understanding why those languages were developed. This all led to JavaScript, which, by the way, has nothing to do with Java, and is one of the most widely used programming languages, despite the fact that many will argue that it's not a very well-formed language. These languages are interesting because they were important historically, and they were shaped by an evolution of opinions in the programming community. On the other hand, some opinions are not so well-informed. They're confusing and complex, and even when they're popular, there's a lot of things that are, people could argue, not ideal about them. JavaScript is a really good example of a ubiquitous programming language. It has a lot of great things about it, but there are a lot of things that many people disagree with. These opinions aren't wrong, and the people who built them are not terrible people or bad programmers, but it's okay to understand that there are some things out there that you don't agree with and that you don't want to emulate. So what does this mean for you? What this means ultimately is pretty simple. First, remember to be kind towards your fellow engineers and their work. Second, as you go through your career, ask yourself these three questions. What is this code's opinion? What is my opinion? And why do I agree or disagree with the code that I am reading? Okay, your ideologies are just as important as your code. Our industry was founded by people who have very strong ideologies. There are a lot of things our generation takes for granted. Free and open information, open source code, a booming technology industry that keeps us all employed and will likely soon employ some of you. But these things are not just happy accidents. The history of computing is full of people who had strong ideologies, which made computing what it is today. So first, let's take a look at some of the ideologies that have gotten us to where we are. In order to do that, we're going to take a look at the history of Silicon Valley. And you'll have to excuse me that the history I'm giving you is very America-centric and very Silicon Valley-centric. What can I say? We're a little bit self-centered out there. So way, way back, before the Industrial Revolution, the Bay Area was the site of the California Gold Rush. There was a huge influx of people coming out to the Wild West to try to make money off of speculation. And that sentence is about a time period in 1850, not 2015, although you could literally apply it to today. This led to an agricultural boom, as more farmers were needed to grow food for a larger population. And the Central Valley in California is very fertile, and most of the Bay Area back then was orchards. And to get this fruit out to the world, there were a few key shipping ports. There are smaller ports down near San Jose, Santa Cruz, and Monterey, which shipped to larger ports up in San Francisco and Oakland, which shipped out to the world. And you can kind of see a little bit of the coastline on this map here, but basically down south, shipped up north, shipped out everywhere. This shipping infrastructure became incredibly important as soon as wars started happening, namely World War I and World War II. The ports that were previously used to ship agriculture were now being used to ship missiles out to the world. Wars are generally large drivers of innovation because wars are generally large drivers of funding. Money leads to innovation, which is a good and sometimes depressing fact to remember. So during World War I and World War II, the Bay Area is taken over by military bases, manufacturing plants, and the necessary infrastructure to build and ship weapons internationally. So, fun tangent, this became very real to me a few years ago when I was working in a neighborhood called Soma, right next to some of the ports in San Francisco. It's right near the ballpark for anyone who's been. And they are developing a lot of apartments and condos down there. It used to just be, it's landfill, so it's all land that's been filled in with dirt. And it used to just be parking lots, but we have a housing crisis. So, some of the builders uncovered a World War II warhead. If you take a look at the picture, it's actually off to the right. It's way inland. It's not anywhere near the water that they discovered it. And it must have fallen off of a ship into the mud when it was being loaded. And then over the years, that land has been filled in as landfill. And so they had to call in the bomb squad, and it was this whole big thing. It was really exciting. But that warhead was from World War II because they were shipping missiles out of there 80 years ago. So back to World War II, the beginning of modern computing started around this time. The original computer, nuclear power, jet engines, and cybernetics were all invented during World War II. A great deal of early computing was linked to military defense, and the militarization of computers shaped early software engineers' ideas about their ethical responsibilities. So this is a picture of Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics during World War II, and he was also one of the early pioneers of ethics in computer programming. He was vehemently against political and military interference with scientific research, I think for obvious reasons. So after World War II ends, there's a bit of lull in military activity, and this leaves a lot of leftover infrastructure like warehouses and manufacturing plants, which were all sitting empty. So remember how historically California was the site of the gold rush, and there was a large influx of people into the state hoping to make it rich panning for gold. Well, this attitude of speculation was still linked to the area, and it comes back around after World War II. So combine that with a bunch of empty infrastructure, it makes sense that the commercial technology industry started there. So people were encouraged to start companies. There were a few weird coincidences, like William Shockley, the inventor of the transistor, came back to Palo Alto to care for his ailing mother, and then started one of the first startups ever. And then financiers came from the stodgy, uptight East Coast to begin investing in this crazy new startup industry. So following this time period, we have the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the Civil Rights Movement. In the 60s, at least in the United States, saw widespread civil unrest. And this set the stage for a period in history where the government and large institutions played the role of the antagonist. So as a result, engineers during this time period were concerned with building computer systems that protected users from these institutions. So ethical discussions during this time period focused mainly on speech and privacy, and were widely influenced by the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the hippie free love movement. It's no accident that shortly following this period, Richard Stallman started the free software movement, and free software, free love is actually what I wish he had named the movement, but I don't think he would have gone for that. So Stallman came from a background in academics, and he joined the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab in 1971. So academics in computer programming freely shared their software source code with each other at the time, which is the underpinnings of the free software movement. The community's focus was on understanding and improving software rather than commercial success. So it made complete sense to them to just share their source code around so that they could read it and improve it and work off of each other's work. This background in academia is where Stallman's belief about free and open software started. And shortly following the collapse of the MIT AI lab community, Stallman says he faced a stark moral choice. The easy choice was to join the proprietary software world, signing non-disclosure agreements and promising not to help my fellow hacker. Most likely, I would also be developing software that was released under non-disclosure agreements, thus adding to the pressure on other people to betray their fellows too. I could have made money this way, and perhaps amused myself writing code, but I knew that at the end of my career, I would look back on years of building walls to divide people and feel I had spent my life making the world a worse place. So Stallman had some pretty strong convictions. He then started GNU, can I never say that one, and built a free and open operating system, and his open source movement is still alive today. Around the same time, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were getting their start in the world of commercial software. So while Bill Gates was at school at Harvard, he sold the programming language BASIC to the company Altair even before he had created it. He then dropped out of Harvard and started a little company called Microsoft. Gates is a staunch defender of software patents and once used the term communist to characterize those who oppose proprietary software. And I have no idea who he was talking about. The commercial computing world spent the next 30 years making personal computers mainstream devices. And without companies like Microsoft and Apple building and selling commercial software, we likely wouldn't have the powerful devices that we have today. Innovation would have taken far longer without customers and capital. So now, fast forward to the 90s, best decade ever. We're at the dawn of the commercial internet. So we're coming out of a time period of extended war. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, and the world is opening up. And so in 1991, Phil Zimmermann, one of the fathers of public key encryption, created PGP, which is pretty good privacy, and released it as the first open source encryption program so that anyone could securely transfer and store files. He believed that cryptography and encryption, originally used to protect government communications from other governments, could also protect user communications and information on the web. He was actually the subject of a massive investigation after he released PGP because his code was downloaded outside of the US. And at the time, it was illegal to distribute encryption algorithms. So he was investigated for munitions export without a license, and although he was never charged. So Phil Zimmermann is quoted as saying, "The natural flow of technology tends to move in the direction of making surveillance easier, and the ability of computers to track us doubles every 18 months. Professor Fred Turner perfectly sums up this transformation from militarized computing to a free and open internet in his book From Counterculture to Cyberculture, which I highly recommend reading. He says, "In the early 1960s, computers haunted the American popular imagination. Bleak tools of the Cold War, they embodied the rigid organization and mechanical conformity that made the military-industrial complex possible. But by the 1990s, and at the dawn of the internet, computers started to represent a very different kind of a world, a collaborative and digital utopia modeled on the communal ideas of the hippies who so vehemently rebelled against the Cold War establishment in the first place." So it's a little bit academic and elegantly worded, but basically what he's saying is computers used to be scary, and now they're actually these tools for free and open sharing. So just to recap the ideologies that we covered in a brief history of Silicon Valley, we covered the militarization and anti-militarization of technology, privacy, free speech, the Wild West, speculative investment, free and open information, free love, and capitalism and the commercialization of computing. And that is just a small subset of the ideologies that it took to get computing where it is today. So the big question is, what ideologies are going to shape computing going forward? And as cool as this history is, as much as I really like to get into the history of computing, the point of sharing it with you is to show you that engineers, just like you, who once sat on the cusp of a career in computer programming, just like you, have shaped the world that we live in today, not just through their code, but through their beliefs about how people should be able to interact in the digital world. Computers are more ubiquitous than ever, and the magnitude of our problems are bigger than ever. So privacy, security, free speech, free access to information, and the globalization of society are all things that we're dealing with right now. Everyone who chooses to be a programmer will at some point deal with an issue related to one of those topics. As you go out into the world and build software, you will make decisions that affect what users can and cannot do with your technology. You will decide how secure and private people's information is on your platform. And those decisions will have a powerful and widespread impact. Some of the problems that we should be thinking about include diversity and inclusivity. We are not so good at that, and we're going to need everyone in the future. And we're also going to need to make sure that our platforms allow for diversity and inclusivity on them. Security, we're not so diligent about that sometimes. Online bullying, harassment, and safety. How far should free speech be allowed to go online? Privacy, Should we be selling users' information to advertisers? Government oversight. We should probably be monitoring and participating in legislation around government oversight of the computing industry. Some of the questions in this area are very nuanced, and there's no right answer. Take, for example, the concept of privacy. Privacy is often a key motivator of free speech and security. Yet privacy can also give users on the internet the power to do harmful things to others without repercussions. It allows users not just to speak out against an institution like the government, but to potentially release secrets about the government, which are illegal to share with the public. It allows them to express opinions openly, but some of those opinions could be death threats towards another user on a website. Where do we draw the line about what should and should not be allowed in the digital world? The software engineering community is still relatively small. The estimates I found online for 2014, which granted is almost 2 years ago now, is that there are about 19 million programmers worldwide. There were 7.1 billion people in the world in 2014, which means that software engineers make up 0.27% of the world, so a fraction of a percent. And 0.27% of the world is building software for the rest of it. And if you consider just the people who use the internet in 2014, which is 2.9 billion people, even then programmers are 0.66% of internet users. So a very tiny number of people are building software for everybody else. And what does this mean for you and your future? Well, first, every single one of you has a significant and powerful voice in shaping a significant and powerful community. Computing has been shaped by major historical events, but also people who had strong ideologies and were thoughtful about the future of computing. And as idealistic as the tech industry is today, we have a lot of problems to think about, both internally and externally. And I definitely don't have any answers to give you. The point is simply to think about your choices, your work, and what it means in the larger context of the world and the future of technology. Your beliefs and ideologies are more important than the code that you write, so make sure that you have some. And the questions to ask yourself are these. If we build software based on our ideologies, you should know, what do I believe in? Why do I believe in that? And how does what I'm building exemplify my beliefs about the world? The final category, software engineering, is a young field, and we don't know what we don't know yet. So one of my pet peeves is this argument that crops up periodically in the programming community about whether or not software engineers are real engineers. Now, as much as I love a good existential discussion about meaning and purpose and language semantics, which I'm not kidding, I actually love those discussions, the reason I don't like this argument is because people will often compare software engineering to civil engineering to make the point that because we lack the discipline and rigor that exists in civil engineering, we are not real engineers. They claim that if civil engineers built bridges the way that we build software, then most of the bridges would be falling down. But the main reason I dislike this comparison is because it's incomplete. And let me explain why. We are an absurdly young field. The comparison to civil engineering is incomplete because people have been building buildings and bridges since the early days of human civilization. And so let's take bridge building as an example and go back to the very beginning of bridges. A tree falls over a ravine, creating a bridge that is safe for many people and animals to travel over for many years. Is the tree an engineer because it successfully created a usable, safe bridge? I like to think so. A beaver builds a dam that successfully works as a bridge for many years. Also, these were the first inhabited bridges, and humans weren't able to build inhabited bridges until the 12th century. Are beavers good engineers? Absolutely. They are great engineers. People then began putting up their own bridges. Streams needed to be crossed, so people would throw wood, rocks, or any materials at hand, and that counted as bridge building. Success was determined by how many people made it across and how many people died. It's probably no surprise here, but the Romans were some of the most impressive bridge builders of the ancient world. Some of the Roman bridges, like this one from the 1st century AD, are still standing today. These bridges were made possible by improvements in materials, namely the invention of concrete, and trial and error, which led to a design for bridges that could hold substantially heavier loads. Bear in mind that these bridges, while architectural marvels, were created before Newton discovered calculus in the 17th century. So, despite their enormous success with bridges, the Romans technically still didn't know what they were doing, and they could not have given you the mathematics to explain why their bridges did not fall down. Fun fact, the first book on bridge engineering was written in 1716, fully 1,500 years after the Romans were building bridges. The first iron bridge was built shortly after that in 1779. And with the discovery of calculus in the 17th century and the invention of iron, bridge building improved dramatically. And over the next several hundred years, that plus the Industrial Revolution, we have modern bridge building. Despite all of this, despite thousands of years of trial and error, despite huge leaps in material science, mathematics, and engineering practices, some bridges still fail due to poor planning, miscommunications, and even physics. And one of the most famous bridge failures was the Tacoma Bridge collapse in 1940. Let's see if we can get this GIF to play. Where gale force winds provided an external periodic frequency that matched the bridge's natural structural frequency, causing it to gallop and then ultimately collapse, which is super cool, but not so great for bridge building. And edge cases are a really, really terrible thing in civil engineering. So again, we are an incredibly young field. Bridge building has been going on for thousands of years. The software industry, by comparison, is maybe at most 100 years old. Modern computing, which is what I define as using computer hardware to write code, has arguably been only mainstream for about 50 to 60 years. So many people still alive today saw the beginning of modern computing. And while we get to piggyback off of the mathematical and scientific progress that has been made during the history of bridge building, there is still so much that we don't know. We are in what I call the early chaos phase of the technology industry. There's so much we don't know yet, and while technology has made it possible for us to share information at an unprecedented rate, we're still figuring out how to organize the complex systems of people required to build large software systems. In 1,000 years, people will look back on our code, if any of it is still around, as this ancient thing from the very early days of computing, a lot like that Roman bridge from the 1st century. So we're building amazing things, but in some ways we don't really know what we're doing yet. While we might know how things work from a technical perspective, there's still a lot of human organization and coordination that we need to figure out. After all, bridges aren't built by just a few people. In fact, building bridges and buildings is a very complex task that has rigid rules to manage the large number of people and tasks that need to be completed. So some things we should think about going forward include, as we think about how to organize systems of programmers, it's important to remember that at this point in history, people who write a lot of code do a lot of things and don't embody any single one of them. Sometimes we engineer, sometimes we science, sometimes we math. Sometimes you could call what we're doing composing, constructing, or assembling. These are all parts of being a software engineer, programmer, coder, or general badass, or whatever you want to call yourself today. But this will probably not be the case forever. As systems become more and more complex, specialization will become more and more necessary. Right now, there are different tracks within the computer science and software engineering degrees at universities. In the future, it could be that there will be many more different types of computing degrees than there are even now, with less shared information between the fields. An architect is not a contractor, is not a construction worker, but they are all necessary to build a bridge. We can already see some of this segmenting happening in the industry with the specialization of programmers in jobs. Operating systems developers are not the same as embedded systems developers, are not the same as web developers, are not the same as networking engineers. But they are all necessary for building different parts of different systems. Additionally, as people use software for more and more things, we have a lot to think about in terms of regulation. Do security engineers need to be accredited? Do companies need to have a certain number of accredited engineers maintaining security and development standards? Do we need to regulate the design of systems in order to maintain privacy and security for users? Civil engineering has a massive number of regulations and standards that have to be met for bridges and buildings to deem them safe and usable for people. Will the same be true for software engineering in the future? So what does this mean for you? The reason that I think it's important to remember that our field is so young is that we need to remember to be patient with ourselves. We need to understand that change is coming. I mean, we're all kind of used to change, but more is coming, and we need to be prepared for that. We need to follow the legislation being passed in our countries and participate in that process so that governments can make informed decisions about regulations to impose or not to impose on the computing world. Net neutrality is a really good example of this, and a lot of technology companies and individuals were involved in pushing back on legislation that would introduce tiered internet systems. So while our industry does move fast, like to move fast and break things, as we mature and more people trust software with sensitive data and tasks, we need to think about the safety of people using our systems. At what point does safety trump speed? And most importantly, we all need to be thinking about these things now. Our field changes so rapidly that in order to make thoughtful decisions about how we should organize engineers or regulate engineers, we need to be thinking about it constantly, or we'll be caught by surprise. So, in that vein, here are a few questions I think you should ask yourself. What does it mean to be a software engineer? And what will our field look like in the future? So, to sum up my talk, here are the 3 things that I wish I had known when I started programming. I don't have any answers for you because I don't really think that there are any answers. I want to leave you with a bunch of questions that I hope you will ask yourself continuously as you go through your life as a software engineer. So first, software engineer is just one person's opinion, or software code is just one person's opinion about how to solve a problem. So ask yourself, what is this code's opinion? What is my opinion? And why do I agree or disagree with the code that I am reading? Number 2, the ideologies that you have are just as important as the code that you write. So ask yourself, what do I believe in? Why do I believe in that? And how does what I'm building exemplify my beliefs about the world? And finally, software engineering is a young field, and we don't know what we don't know yet. So ask yourself, what does it mean to be a software engineer? And what will our field look like in the future? I wanted to give you more questions than answers today, like I said. And I hope that these topics will make you think about your opinions, your ideologies, and your work, and how it will fit into the world at large. Your ability to impact the world through programming is significant. And that's a responsibility that I think we should all be very thoughtful about. Hopefully, today's talk will give you some questions and ideas to help you form your beliefs going forward. So now, we have questions, which is my favorite part of the talk. If you don't feel comfortable standing up at a mic, you're welcome to save your questions and ask me later. I could talk about these topics all day, so please come find me. Additionally, if you have more of a discussion point, I'm more than happy to hear it. You don't have to have a specific question for me, because I don't pretend to have any answers for you. If you want to get in touch with me after this conference, you can tweet at me, or there's a contact page on my personal website. And thank you so much for listening.
Sweet, that was awesome. Thank you very much. So yeah, if you guys have any questions for Kate, there's 2 microphones. Oh, you're ahead of me, dude. So good job. Let's go.
Oh, okay. So my question for you is, do you feel like our field is mature enough to want to actually join a professional engineering body, a regulatory body, like Professional Engineers Ontario or Order of Engineers of Quebec?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's still a little early. I think, unfortunately, we're going to make some more mistakes that are going to have probably some really bad side effects, and that is going to drive a lot of that regulation and push it forward. So I think that engineers need to be really thoughtful about potentially like how do we want to organize and how do we want to regulate, because my guess is something's going to happen that's bad, and then everyone's going to be like, you have to regulate. And we're going to be like, okay, and so we should know what we want to do then. I don't think we need to do it necessarily now. Like I said, things are a bit chaotic. Most people really have no idea what they're doing. I think the first things to be regulated are probably going to be security and privacy, right? So if you're an application developer, like what I do most of the time, probably not a lot of regulation. However, if I'm building something that stores credit cards, like those types of things are regulated today.
Sorry, one of the key issues that are usually brought up whenever it's topics like this, say, should software engineering become a more accredited field, is that some people, including myself, don't really see code as an engineering sort of architecture. We see it more as artistic expression. Mm-hmm. So how do you respond to that?
I think programming is a lot of things, and so that was part of my point in the last section. Like we engineer sometimes we're using computer science, sometimes we're writing, sometimes it feels like we're architecting, and it's a lot of different things. Computers are built on a very strong concept of abstraction, right? So if you talk about the history of programming languages, right? Programming languages get broken down into something the computer can understand, and we write in a language that we can understand. And so that concept of abstraction is going to be really important for different parts of the system going forward. Some people in the future who touch computer code, I don't think will call it engineering. And that's totally fine. Like I said, how does the concept of a construction worker fit in? A lot of times what I do as a web application developer feels more like assembling things. I'm like, I take these pieces and I put them together and that's fine. I wouldn't consider that engineering. I don't think we are any one of those. I think we can do many of those things, and as we segment fields going forward, it will become clearer who is doing which of those tasks. Okay. So it's okay if right now you don't know which one you do.
I just have one more point of discussion, is that now we just don't only have software engineering that's strictly code. We're bleeding into other topics because computer science is very general. We have a bioinformatics or a neuroscience, so we're getting into different fields, and I'm not sure how, moving forward, we're going to regulate just software engineering versus software and law and software and biophysics or something.
Yeah. I mean, I have no idea either. Like it's a massively broad field. How many people, when you tell them you work with computers, are like, oh, can you fix my computer? Oh, like, do you do this? Can you hack into computers? And you're like, those are like just wildly different things. It's a huge field that gets boxed into one thing. And so part of organizing the chaos is going to be clarifying those things. So it will be a bit of a discussion about word semantics, but I think it should be more constructive than comparing ourselves to a field that's 2,000 years old and has a lot of regulation already.
Hello. Assuming you wouldn't be comparing the field to any other field, how would you strike a balance within an organization in which no one really knows what they're doing, so they will do mistakes, but then you also want minimum level of quality, security, and whatnot, so how do you set liability, which is what we don't really have? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, right? So sometimes you can fail and sometimes you can't, right? Like if I ship code that has a bug in it, and that bug is like, a button won't click, that's fine, right? Like that doesn't hurt anyone, and that's an area where like allowing for a certain amount of failure is probably okay. There are other areas where failure is not an option. So think, we were talking to someone from GE the other day, like the code that runs in your car. Probably don't want that to fail. Like anything that has to do with flying an airplane, we don't want that to fail. And so depending on like what you're building for and why, the fault tolerance level is very different. And some of those things are obvious, right? Like if your code can kill someone, pretty low fault tolerance level. There are ethical boundaries, right? If your code fails, it could be emotionally damaging to someone. Where do we draw those lines? And then in some spaces, allowing for failure and allowing for mistakes, I think, is actually a very good thing. So yeah, it hugely depends. I don't know if I answered your question.
Hey, Kate. Thanks for the talk. My question kind of stems from the fact that you're saying that software engineering or the software industry is a relatively young industry, but it's also a really hot industry right now. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on upcoming software engineers and their thoughts on this market maybe getting saturated soon?
I don't think it's going to be saturated anytime soon. There's the estimates for the number of computing jobs coming out is almost double the number of people we're putting into the field. To a certain degree, throwing more bodies at some problems doesn't really help, but there's not going to be a shortage of jobs and opportunities. I think for us, everyone going into the field or everyone who's in the field, being really thoughtful about your role in it is going to be important. Yeah. But I don't see it getting saturated anytime soon. So job security, that's why I became an engineer. My brother told me that everyone gets a job after college, and I was like, great. Yeah.
Hi, we're seeing more and more children being thought programming at a very young age with block programming stuff. I think Harvard uses Scratch and MIT as well. How do you think that's going to affect the industry in the future? Because they're being shown languages that in the same way that they're being taught, like French, English, but at a very young age.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from talks I've seen on education, there tend to be two different things that people think about. One is what's called computer literacy. So the breadth of people who understand basic computing will hopefully be higher in the future. Right? Right now, there are a lot of people who just have no idea what we do. They don't understand logic as a field. They even if you were to explain to them, there are these different segments in the industry, they wouldn't really understand what that meant. So computer literacy is one thing I think is good, when you talk about teaching young children. The other thing is depth. So are we going to get more programmers who come out with more experience early on? And I don't even know what that would look like. I imagine that there's several types of advances that we make in the field. People tend to think of pure technology advances as being the only kinds of advances. So when transistors were invented, when certain programming languages were created, making other types of tasks possible. But there's actually a lot of types of innovation that happen. Like I said, organizing people is a big one. So the way that people build buildings took a long time to organize and to kind of parse out. And so we have a lot of that work to do. Usability is a huge space for innovation, which has nothing to do with, it's not exactly technical innovation. So touchscreens, for example, pushed personal computing and iPhone devices forward hugely. And yes, there was a technical component to that, but the big innovation is the fact that you can interact with your phone by touching it, which is a natural human way of interacting with the world. Same thing with the mouse, the desktop, things like that. Those aren't technology innovations, those are usability innovations. And so those are the spaces that I see us needing innovation for, and I'm not sure exactly how teaching young children will impact that, other than we'll have kids thinking about it from an earlier age, and that's awesome. So.
Thanks.
You talked earlier about crafting your ideologies. Do you have any particular suggestions for resources like books, blogs, conferences, magazines that are particularly inspirational or controversial that we should maybe look into?
Yes. Let me try to think of some off the top of my head. I mean, there are the big players in history. I personally love reading about ethics, in other fields. So in ethical discussions in medicine are really interesting. Yes, and you know what I'll do? I'll make a link of those and then I'll tweet it out or something.
Perfect.
Because yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Cool. Well, if anyone has any more questions or thoughts, feel free to come find me afterwards, and have a great rest of your conference.